This lecture continues the late empire by looking at both the soldier emperors and the tetrarchy that is established in a last-ditch attempt to unify the vast empires that Rome is responsible for and ensure political stability. Now, the late empire will last from Septimius Severus, the African-born general, through the death of Constantine in 337, after the capital of Rome will move to Constantinople. In this period, we find the borders are in revolt. Rome is on the defensive, and they are having difficulty controlling the barbarian hordes, as they call them, on their doorsteps. Things become so bad they begin paying the barbarians themselves to police their borders. Severus Alexander is the last in the Severan dynasty, and his life will end with murder, as so many others, in the following half-century, when we have continuous civil war, where general after general will be declared emperor by their troops and then viciously murdered, usually by the Praetorian Guard sworn to protect them. This period lasts between 235 and 284, and in this period we have 16 emperors, and it is amazing how many there are given the short period. As an example, just perusing the names here and how they died, one can see that most of them are assassinated or die in battle. Maximinus Thrax, we will discuss himself, a very large and imposing man, will be assassinated, followed by others who commit suicide, die in battle. This period lasts until Numerian, the very last soldier emperor, is also going to be assassinated, a very politically unstable time to live. This is a very violent period where the Senate is powerless in the face of the Praetorian Guard, who was sworn to protect the emperor but holds all the power, and the provincial armies that will continually revolt and declare their own general to be king, hoping that will be a career-making opportunity for them. Now, the soldier emperors lack the luxury of long-range planning and the security to initiate large building projects. Instead, they're going to produce large quantities of coins to pay the troops and have their own portraits made to ensure people know who the current emperor is, because they change so quickly it is hard to keep track. The brutality of this period is exemplified by the events of 238, in which we find the death of no less than 5 emperors in only a few months. This begins with Maximinus Thrax, the Thracian, who is in his 3rd year of rule. It is at this time that we find a man of humble beginning is able to propel himself through the ranks of the Roman army and legions because of his huge size. He was enormous with his physical strength and stature, and probably suffered from gigantism. Now, the intensity of his personality will also carry on the Aurelian tradition of portraiture seen here. He's going to be shown, like all soldier emperors, with this model of Caracalla and Marcus Aurelius, demonstrating emotional content by turning in one direction, looking off to the side, thus revealing the emotions or the psychological disposition of the figure. The figure also is not going to make eye contact, as though he is lost in thought, disengaged from the surrounding environment. And we find more and more this distressing look on soldier emperors' faces, as the stability and security afforded by the earlier periods are going to be gone in a fleeting memory. Here, the haircut, much like Caracalla, resembles that of a soldier's haircut, which is very closely cropped following the shape of the skull. Soldiers would, of course, cut their hair closely so that it could not be grabbed or snag on something during battle, thus becoming a liability. This massive Thracian is going to be assassinated when Gordian I is going to be hailed emperor by his troops, choosing Gordian II as his co-ruler. The Senate ratifies the decision, but the governor of Numidia in northwest Africa is going to kill the son Gordian II, and Gordian I then commits suicide, ruling only for 1 month. Following this, you have Trajan Decius being declared emperor by his troops, and he will die fighting the Goths or the Germans in Germania. He is primarily remembered for persecuting Christians, which were seen at the time as a threat to the state because they did not recognize the emperors as being deified or as gods, and did not worship the Roman religion. Here we find Trajan Decius, instead of someone who persecutes Christians and is very threatening, shown as an old man with this very sad expression, revealing the nervous anxiety that one would expect in the emotional appeals to portraits established by Marcus Aurelius. The stone is actually modeled as if in pliant clay. Now he nervously glances away, with incised hair and a beard like that of Caracalla, the closely cropped hair associating him with soldiers as a soldier emperor. This is going to be the tradition of Marcus Aurelius, but now we find the war weariness common in Aurelian portraiture has given way to a very clear anxiety, an anxiety-ridden expression. Turning to Trebonianus Gallus, we have another soldier emperor, hailed as such by his own army and troops after Decius's death, dying fighting the Goths. Here we have a massive, larger than life-size heroic nude of this very imposing emperor. He wears military boots and a cloak, but does not have any other clothes on, thus emphasizing the bulk, the girth of his body, which is a wrestler's body with massive legs, a swollen trunk that thus dwarfs his head. The model, of course, taken from these very large, hypertrophied Hellenistic rulers, which are also nude, lifting once again their hand, usually supporting a spear or a staff, thus addressing a crowd in the same way. Now, this is the ideal of ancient gladiators and wrestlers who were appreciated for their brute strength, not their graceful athleticism. This is very much today in the Olympics when we see the different body types between, say, runners and wrestlers or weightlifters. We find that one is appreciated for graceful speed, the other for brute strength. So we find that Augustus is going to appreciate the Greek athleticism and the rather svelte and lean approach to musculature from the classical era, which is considered intellectual. You think about the statues as we discussed. Alternatively, you find Maximinus, the first soldier emperor here in this period, who is going to be catapulted through the ranks because of physical size, shows us that we have a new ideal. It is not their nobility, it is not their education that made these men emperors, that even a man of low birth like Maximinus, who despised the nobility, could become emperor because of his imposing physical size and strength. So now we look to models like the late classical work of Lysippus and his weary Heracles. So the Greek ideal is now gone, in which they appreciated a keen mind and harmoniously proportioned body, which was more lean. Now we have this paradoxical image, which is going to be showcasing immense physical strength, but with a troubled mind, a troubled psyche. So this is going to follow, even though it is a bronze, the marble sculptures that preceded Trebonianus Gallus with Trajan Decius, that is going to scratch the details from the bronze just as they would incise the beard and the hair, carving into the face of Decius here, demonstrating the precarious position of the Romans at this time. The only large-scale architectural project during the period of the soldier emperors was a new defensive wall built around the capital, this by the soldier emperor Aurelian. This illustrates the decay of Roman power, for we now have threats that did not exist in the early and the high empire. We did not need walls around the city because no one would dare enter the peninsula since the Punic Wars and go against Rome head to head. So this new fortified wall was a circuit around the capital over 12 miles long. This expanded the urban center to 3 times the size of the old Republican walls that existed previously. The materials used are almost exclusively reused or reallocated, which are bricks with concrete in the center, thus showcasing and demonstrating the economic difficulties faced by Rome at this time. Even though they're reused materials and cheap concrete, this still put a major strain on the treasury, but it was necessary to protect from these incursions into the peninsula. So after the Severans, we should note that commissions for relief sculpture dry up, but sarcophagi are going to be important for this period in tracing the history and the style of art. So we no longer have massive triumphal arches showcasing one's successes or triumphs. Now we have one's death that's going to be recorded. Now, because of the continuous warfare, both the civil wars that keep taking place where Romans kill Romans, and foreign wars where barbarians are going to make incursions into the Roman interior, we know that workshops that made coffins at this time had a very strong demand for their product. Now, after the Severans, we also have a shift in burial practices, for Romans no longer cremated their dead on funerary pyres. Now they would bury them in sarcophagi, which begs the question, do we already see the influence of New Eastern cults that required one to keep the body whole to be resurrected in, say, Mithraism and Christianity, just a few examples of these new mystery cults. Here we have battle scenes being very popular and appropriate in a time in which warfare is continuous and constant, and the people died who are then going to be buried in these sarcophagi in very violent warlike ways. Here we have the Battle of the Romans and Barbarians, otherwise known as Ludovisi Battle Sarcophagus, because it was owned by the Ludovisi family in Rome. Originally produced 250 to 260 Common Era. On it, we're going to see Romans battling Goths, possibly, which are Germans, in this dense mass of intertwining bodies. That is even more extreme of a rejection of classical perspective than we'd seen earlier with the Decursio, produced for Antonius Pius in remembrance of him on his death. We don't even have the floating ground planes, for instance, and ground lines that previously were demarcated to show where people's feet are. Now we have them stacked in a very illogical fashion, pressed up against the surface. The central horseman is bare-headed and thrusts open his right hand. Thus we find this open gesture illustrates that he holds no weapon. He boasts his fearlessness, that he is assured of victory in this way, and so is going to relate to this notion of living on, being resurrected, being guaranteed eternal life after death. In fact, he has the symbol of Mithras, the Persian god of light, truth, and victory over death on his forehead, which is carved with a cross, showing that he is very influenced by these Oriental mystery religions. So Mithraism is going to come about and grow in popularity at the same time Christianity is. Both of them are very popular in the Roman legions and for soldiers because they could die at any time. The promise of salvation after death is going to be a very attractive one. We also see at this time on sarcophagi a retreat from the outside world and an interest in philosophy, providing solace in this violent time. So we find that many Romans would assume the role of a learned intellectual and teacher, such as seen here. Now we have the deceased in the center who's in the sarcophagus unrolling the scroll with his wife and daughter flanking him, these two women, and his students in the outer section also holding scrolls, showing that they are educated as well. The figures, their dress and appearance, are modeled on and taken from Greek philosophers and muses that were abundant in copies in ancient Rome, such as Demosthenes that we discussed. We find that the toga, the sandals, and the hair all are going to relate the intellectual side of these individuals. The composition is also late antique, we should note, where we have a central figure in a heraldic and hieratic fashion flanked by two subordinate figures on either side of him. So this is going to ensure that we don't move into the scene or suggest narrative urgency that we're moving one direction or the next, but instead this iconic understanding of an unchanging and unmoving subject. Turning now to Probus, who ruled from 276 to 282, we find he's declared emperor and is going to hail his victories in Gaul, modern-day France, as well as Danube and in Egypt. After these great victories, he is murdered by his own troops that were loyal to the Praetorian prefect. Here, following upon this rather expressionistic approach seen in Trajan Decius, his head is a cubical shape, whereas these simplified masses, such as the large, sad eyes, are going to be the model for a new type of portraiture and style to come. The increased stylization and abstraction is common in the iconic style practiced in the late antique period, where we very self-consciously move away from naturalism, not attempting to show individuals necessarily, but the idea of them, such as a philosopher or an emperor. Now, the schematized style is going to be characterized by abstract portraits in the tetrarchic period following it, because the same artists working for Probus in this example are going to be retained for the next emperor's portraits. This is going to be the result of a series of events that end in Numerian, the last soldier emperor, being killed by the Praetorian prefect or head of the Praetorian Guard, Oper. We find that at this time, 40-year-old Diocletian is going to be hailed emperor. He is born in Dalmatia and Yugoslavia today, and will defeat Quirinius, Numerian's brother, for supremacy. Now, Diocletian is going to have a new idea of how Rome should be ruled, departing from his soldier emperor predecessors. He names, first of all, his loyal general Maximian, the Caesar, and then co-Augustus. There is at this time threats on the northern and eastern frontiers and challenges within the Roman army itself. This is why Diocletian brilliantly decides to restore order by sharing power with his rivals, those individuals who would seek to supplant him, to assassinate him. So in 293, he establishes the Tetrarchy, or rule by four. In it, he is going to become Augustus of the East, or the head emperor, and takes Jupiter as his divine epithet. Maximian is going to be much like a vice president, receiving the title Augustus of the West, being promoted to president, taking on Hercules as his divine epithet. They then in turn name two Caesars, or vice presidents, that are going to then eventually take their place. Galerius, who is named Caesar of the East, and Constantius Chlorus, who is named Caesar of the West. The allegiance of this new arrangement is cemented through the marriage of their daughters. Galerius, for instance, divorces his wife to marry Diocletian's daughter. Constantius divorces the mother of Constantine to marry Maximian's stepdaughter. The Tetrarchy might disintegrate here very shortly in 305, but this division of Eastern and Western Europe remains until today. The decision to divide rule by four different emperors is going to lead to a period that it has the most stability in half a century, but is more divided than ever, for we have four emperors in four different centers. We have Constantius, who's establishing his center in Trier, where Diocletian is Nicomedia over here in the east. So we find that Maximian is going to be housed in Milan, while Galerius is in Thessaloniki. So we find that this ensures no one is in Rome, which is now the symbolic center of Rome. The reason why they split up the vast capitals across the Roman Empire is practical. Now they can address military threats more quickly and rapidly than they could before. Now, in showing this new type of rule, we have a very different style. For looking at the tetrarchs, they are impossible to identify without inscriptions, and unfortunately, no inscription survives, so we do not know who they are. We believe this example is a bust of Galerius because it was found in Egypt where Galerius ruled. It is made of porphyry, which is also a stone that is often quarried in North Africa and is brought back to Western Europe prized for its purple color. Now, purple is a highly prized color for the high offices in Rome, rulership, and royalty because of how expensive and difficult this dye is to maintain. So we find that only the royal family and the Praetorian Guard wear the color. Now here we find there is a cubic head, which is in the legacy of Probus, but we have an even greater abstraction. Whereas like the soldier emperors, the hair is negatively carved, now it is going to be incised in a regular pattern. As well, parallel lines are going to form the furrows in the forehead and eyebrows, with round, staring eyes, which are impersonal and iconic in how they are appreciated. We drain the figure of individuality. Instead, we are going to move away from this nervous anxiety of the soldier emperors, merely communicating the message in an iconic or late antique style of emperor, not the likeness of an individual Galerius or any other individual for that matter. No one looks like this. Instead, we are communicating an iconic message that the emperors are going to be unchanging, that they are unfazed, unemotional. This is going to be the opposite of the psychologically insightful portrait from the tradition of Marcus Aurelius, carried on through his children and the following dynasty with Caracalla. Now, the best preserved example of Tetrarchic portraiture is actually in Venice, off here to the side near the entrance to the Doge's palace that connects to the Cathedral of St. Mark's. Here we have the portraits of the 4 tetrarchs, taken from Constantinople, originally produced in 305. Here, made of porphyry, this purple stone indicating their royalty and that they are emperors, shows them all together, not distinguishing them. They are in fact all identically clad with their cuirass or chest plate and their pallidamentum and or this cloak they wear fastened with a fibula around their shoulder. The style is one that is very anti-naturalistic and shows the concord among them, as each is going to place the same hand around the other's shoulder, showing they work together. Now, the only example that we have here is actually taken from 2 columns that were broken off in Constantinople and brought back as spoils of war, as spolia, to Venice after they sacked Constantinople in the 4th Crusade. These Eastern rulers would have been on one column, and the Western rulers would have been on another column. These, as you can see now, are broken and then face next to one another. This is going to be seen in other surviving columns, such as the one seen here, where you have both of the tetrarchs embracing one another with their right hand, while with their left hand they hold a globe, showing they rule the world. Each one of them wears a stiff round cap that Diocletian introduced to the imperial wardrobe from Yugoslavia. It is going to have a peg hole left open here, which would have had a semi-precious stone inserted in it, since of course removed. Here we have an example of what this dress would have looked like with the pallidamentum, with the cuirass, this chest plate, and the flat round cap. The large cubical heads are going to be carried on from Probus in the previous soldier emperor period, with these squat bodies, emphasizing schematic drapery and having emotionless masks as their faces. They are not showing vulnerability or emotion. This is going to show them as paired, just like they are on coins or medallions, one with a beard, one without a beard. So the Augustus, the older one, will wear a beard, whereas the Caesar is going to be beardless, showing that one is older and in charge and more mature, and the other one is up and coming. Now, Thessaloniki is going to be the capital of Galerius, who is the Caesar of the East, and we do have monuments that survive there from this period. It is here that we have an arch, a triumphal arch, created for Galerius, as well as a palace and a mausoleum seen here in the background, this rounded form, which would remind one of the mausoleum of Augustus and the Castel San Angelo, which served as the mausoleum of Hadrian. In a very unusual triumphal arch, this arch of Galerius here, we have an octopylon, which is an arch with 8 piers, commemorating the victory of Galerius over King Narses of Persia. Here, the reliefs are going to be stacked on these friezes and are much less fluid than earlier carvings of military exploits like the Arch of Trajan. Here we see a sarcophagus-like format, which is, of course, the only type of sculptural commissions under the Soldier Emperors, which was the previous generation. Now we have the same size and shape that they're familiar with, this rectangular section with a frieze. So here we have generic scenes that are taken from earlier monuments, not a continuous unfolding narrative tied to the great battles of Galerius. So these mixes in scenes include both battles and ceremonies. The ceremonies include the hieratic and frontal-facing figures that flank one another with a central motif, such as when they are sacrificing or performing their duties as Pontifex Maximus. Here we have Galerius fighting the Persians in this piled-up, chaotic scene, where the emperor is shown larger than everyone else, thus returning to this hierarchy of scale. We find that they are floating with an inconsistent ground plane, much like the late antique and/or iconic approach seen with the Severans. Now, turning to Rome, we have Diocletian, who is only going to be there for a few years, building a new set of baths and a bathing complex on the outskirts of the city, but still within the Aurelianic walls, the central block of which measures 785 by 475 feet. Not as large as the baths of Caracalla, but still impressive. Here we have what survives as a church and a museum today, which are the baths of Diocletian, with the fenestrated sequence of groin vaults still standing, letting in light in the second story. Here we have a pattern that is established by the 80-year-old baths of Caracalla, where we have flanking rooms around the baths. The Diocletianic plan, however, is simplified, substituting groin vaults in the caldarium for a dome, and adding semicircular apses at the center of each side. Here we are alternating with these curved and rectilinear recesses in the rooms, thus experimenting with the shapes afforded by concrete. Here we can see this octagonal hall in the Baths of Diocletian, built between 298 and 306, that now functions as the Museo Nazionale Romano, or the Archaeological Museum, the National Museum of Rome, as it were. Here we're going to see an interior space that would have been set aside for various activities, lectures, athletic events, etc. Now it holds famous works such as the Seated Boxer. Now, the experimental shapes in here are much like the Domus Aurea, where architects are attempting to see what their boundaries are when it comes to concrete. The Baths of Diocletian are going to survive relatively intact, interestingly enough, because they are converted to a church, especially the Frigidarium. Here we have colossal columns with composite capitals and an immense groin vault with the second story letting in light with the clear story. We must originally imagine the additional coloration on the ceiling because it is now going to be merely concrete, but it does provide you with a sense of this imperial architecture that existed at the time and the huge interior spaces that are going to frame it. Now, after visiting Rome in 303 for the first time ever, Diocletian returns home to the east, and for the first time ever, an emperor retires in 305. Retiring on his palatial estate at Split, Croatia, we have a structure built between 298 and 306, which is sprawling 10 acres with octagonal watchtowers and a 600-foot facade facing the sea. He was very instrumental in the structure and in the building here, and Diocletian wanted to ensure his architects made him a well-fortified palace, for he knew there would be assassination attempts even if he was retired. The columnar scream that we normally see on the facades of buildings are going to be gone here, reinforcing the heavy walls that remain fully visible on the exterior, reinforcing the strength of this example with the Porta Aurea. The avenues that intersect here at a colonnaded courtyard are going to be flanking the mausoleum, which is where the city's forum would have been. Now we can see that, like Hadrian, we have the entrance to the residential wing with alternating arches and horizontal pediments. It was here, next to the temple of Jupiter, which was Diocletian's patron god, where his mausoleum would have towered above all other structures with a domed octagonal shape. Today it is dwarfed by the campanile or bell tower, which is the religious Christian structure, but still is massive. Here we find that Egyptian sphinxes are going to be on the outside, thus providing an introduction and guardians for the underworld as they had in Egypt. On the interior, we have two tiers of red granite columns that were imported from Egypt. The second level is, of course, made of porphyry, this purple stone, which is going to be reserved for emperors and royalty. Now, Diocletian would retire in 305, leaving Constantius Chlorus and Galerius to become Augusti, with two new Caesars being appointed. However, orderly succession would be upset here shortly with civil war, out of which Constantius's son Constantine would emerge victorious, becoming the sole emperor once again at the very end of the Roman Empire. So here we're going to leave off and return with Constantine next time.